Hello and welcome everybody to Wigtown Wednesday. My name is Lee Randall and I am here in my hallway in Edinburgh, and I'm delighted today to be talking to Laura Cumming to discuss her book on Chapel Sands. But first, the housekeeping. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a chat box. That's what you use to say hello to one another and to us and to put your questions in. We may or may not get to them. There's a lot to get through tonight. We'll get to as many as we can and probably integrate them into the conversation. In the chat box, you will also find links to the festival's donate page. You can imagine it takes a lot of money to put on a festival, even digitally, and every penny helps if you're able to contribute. As well, there'll be a link to the festival bookshop where you can buy this terrific memoir, which we're talking about tonight. So without further ado, Laura Cumming has been the Observer's art critic since 1999, and before that worked as the literary editor for the BBC's The Listener magazine, at the New Statesman, and as a presenter of Nightwaves on Radio 3. Her book, The Vanishing Man in Pursuit of Velasquez, was an acclaimed New York Times bestseller, and it won the James Tate Black Biography Prize in 2017. Her very first book, A Face to the World, explored self-portraiture and by extension the idea of selfhood itself. With On Chapel Sands, however, she's given us a deeply personal story about a family mystery and, of course, about the mysteriousness of family. On Chapel Sands was the Sunday Times Book of the Year, and it's been shortlisted for both the 2019 Baillie Gifford Prize and the Costa Award for Biography and Memoir. Critics very rightly fell in love with On Chapel Sands. They called it elegant, tender, and transfixing. The Spectator said, "It's a mystery solved through empathy and interpretation, a moving tribute from a daughter to her parents and grandparents." This book was written with her mother's blessing and as a platform for her mother's own memories of her childhood. But rather than give you any summary that I might compose, we're going to let the story unfold as we talk, because this particular journey of discovery and its destination are quite fittingly, given her mother's artwork, the warp and weft of a complicated tapestry. So welcome, Laura. I'm so delighted to be here talking to you, and I'm hoping that you'll kick things off with a reading from your book.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Lee. That was really uplifting, and hello to all of you. I'm very delighted to be part of the festival. Dumfriesshire is a great place in my heart, and I'm from Edinburgh, so thank you. And I am going to just do, it's only about 50 seconds, this reading, but it is a very condensed emblem of everything that I'm trying to do in the book. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to read it. This is the book. This is my tiny mother. And this is a man called Frank who comes into the story in a very tragic way and a strange way. But more than anything, I want you, if you can see that cover, that is Chapel Sands behind the figures. And you can probably see, just from looking at that, the beach is completely flat, which is crucial to the strangeness of what is about to take place. And I'm just going to read this very, very short introduction. This is the first paragraph or so of On Chapel Sands, and it's chapter 1, The Beach. This is how it began and how it would end. On the long, pale strand of a Lincolnshire beach in the last hour of sun, the daylight moon small as a kite in the sky. Far below, a child of 3 was playing by herself with a new tin spade. It was still strangely warm in that autumn of 1929, and she had taken off her plimsolls to feel the day's heat lingering in the sand beneath her feet. Short fair hair, no coat, blue eyes, dressed to match. That was the description later given to the police. She'd come out of the house that afternoon and along the short path to the beach with her mother, Mrs. Vida Elston. They'd already been there for some time with biscuits in an old tartan tin, digging and sieving the sand. The tide was receding when they arrived, the concussion of waves on the shore gradually quietening as the day wore on. By now the sea was almost half a mile in the distance. In this lull, on their own familiar beach, and so comfortingly close to home, Vida must have let her daughter wander free for a moment, for she did not see what happened next. Someone moved swiftly across the beach and began talking to the little girl, someone she perhaps knew, because no sounds were heard as they coaxed her away. 1 minute she was there, barefoot and absorbed, spade in hand. Seconds later, she was taken off the sands at the village of Chapel St. Leonard's, apparently without anybody noticing at all. Thus was my mother kidnapped. Beginning with that reading, which I think in a way it sort of sets the whole tone for the way that I wanted to write this story. Every word of what you've just heard is fact and not fiction, but every time anybody picks this book up in a shop, it seems that they think it's a novel. And I can understand that, because I wanted very much for the reader to experience that scene as dramatically as possible. And I think I've only really indulged myself at one point in that first paragraph where I say that it was strangely warm. Actually, it was, I think, strangely warm, late October in 1929. And if you know that coastline, it gets terrific northeasterly winds. It's usually very, very cold on that beach, and it wasn't that day. And as anybody researching their family history, and I'm sure all of you will have, you want to know what was the exact circumstance, what to picture the scene. And the fact that the temperature chart for that day, these things that we are wonderfully able to know using computers, stuck at home as we are, does seem strangely warm. And for me, that gave it a kind of strangely sort of sinister note to it. Obviously, for most of my life, not obviously, but for most of my life, and for the whole of my mother's life, until she was 60 years old, she didn't know that she had been kidnapped from that beach. She knew nothing of it. She was 3. She'd just not long turned 3 at that time. And she hasn't any memory of that. So that when she learned of it, she was very shocked. And the fact that she didn't remember it was very significant to all of us, because it either implied that the memory was so terrible, it was sort of cauterized in her mind, she had sort of lost this memory, or that actually whatever happened to her was in some way unexceptional, and therefore she didn't register it. So when I write in that opening that possibly the person who took her might have known her, my thinking about that, because we didn't know who took her for a very long time, was also, I suppose, altered by my sense that the fact that she couldn't remember it might be a good thing and not something horrific, as indeed it will turn out.
You, for your 21st birthday, you asked your mother to write her life story. That was your gift from her. And much of this book incorporates chunks of that beautifully written memoir. Why did you ask for that as a gift?
A wonderful question. I asked for it because this story of my mother's early life is set in this little tiny village with 400 souls, and very, very farmers and fishermen and little cottages and still paraffin lamps, and one big house on a raised bank with one private telephone, one generator, a tennis court, and so on. And it always seemed to me to be very much, I've written in the book about this, very much the sort of Cluedo board, that house, and very much a sort of slightly Agatha Christie scene, with the poor, the one and only constable who lives in that area, cycling up and down the coast trying to find my mother for days, and so on, and no way of communicating the news except by telegram and so on. But I asked her to write the memoir when I was 21, because this little tiny village had become, I'm mentioning Agatha Christie, but it had been very much like a little novel to me. All the characters, and they were characters to me in this village, were sort of mythological. And this was because my mother lived in a 2-up, 2-down house in this village, where she was more or less imprisoned by her parents. In hindsight, anyone listening to this now will think that's probably got something to do with the kidnap. But my mother, if you recall, had no idea she'd been kidnapped. So she never really understood at all why she was kept at home. And the way that she saw this village was by dint of a swing that her father had made for her, hanging from a tree in their garden. And the swing at its zenith point would show the world over the top of the wall in this little kind of hamlet. And so up and down the hamlet would come these characters, and the characters fascinated me as a child. And my mother's an artist, and she painted them too. So there would be the figure of, you know, the dairyman who would go along on his bicycle, always with this, you know, defunct cigarette stuffed in his mouth, and 2 filthy cows and a terrible awful old dairy. And there would be the shepherd who looked like George Bernard Shaw with a very long beard. And there would be the one who particularly fascinated me was Lily Bodice, who ran the draper's shop, which sold bodices in this village. And it seemed kind of absolutely impossible to me growing up that there could really be a bodice seller called Bodice. And so all of these figures, many of them born in the 1880s, including my mother's parents, they all seem to be so antique, you know. I mean, there were still people in the 1920s wearing long black clothes and so on. And they were huge figures in her imagination. She had no friends. She wasn't allowed to play with anyone. She wasn't really allowed to go from one end of the village to the other, even in case she met the wrong sort of people. And so as for all of us, the elements of our childhood are vast. And unusually, I suppose, the elements of her childhood were vast to me too. I didn't understand the puzzle of her life or the tragedy of it. I didn't understand why my grandfather George, Mr. George Elston, Vida's husband, was a figure of great hatred. My mother is a very, very abundantly loving person, and she never spoke about him. He was never, ever mentioned. And I think it was probably not till I was about 18, and around that age where you start to wonder where your grandparents are buried or what kind of life they had, that I discovered that my mother actually didn't know where he was buried, which was a great mystery for me. So she talked about these elements of her life in this little coastal village so rivetingly that I asked her to write it down. And also possibly, I suppose at that stage I was a student, and I think maybe I was beginning to wonder if it might shift her thinking a little bit, and she might start wondering what the answer to some of the questions, you know, why was she not allowed to play with children? Why was she not sent to school until she was quite old? What were the answers? So she wrote it for me, and the very last lines of it are, I had written saying to her from university, saying it was the most wonderful thing, you know, and she wrote back that she was very pleased, and now she would know what to give me for many years to come. So the next chapter would be, you know, the next Christmas present, and so it would go on. But she never, ever wrote another part to this, and the memoir stops when she's more or less about 14. And I now know, I think, why she couldn't write any more beyond that. But if things had been different, she would still be writing her life story for me every year. So I've chosen to write it to some extent to finish this investigation for her, because she's now 94 and she's not able to think about these things. She's very frail, and I had hoped that she would write it and find out what the end of these extraordinary puzzles about her identity were. But she wanted me to do it, I think, herself in the end, because I don't suppose she really wanted to know some of the answers. And now I do. And so hence the book.
Because you yourself have a background in art, and of course your parents were artists, your way in and much of your investigation for this book consists of poring over images. Both these little tiny photographs, the photographic record of your mother as a child, although only part of her childhood, and also great works of art, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So was there one image, I'm hoping you might hold up some of the images from the book, and I know you'll be speaking to them, but I'm wondering, was there one particular image, and perhaps it's the one you chose for the cover, of your mother that really you kept coming back to, you kept returning to, and thinking, this, if I can unlock the mystery of this picture, I will know all.
Well, there was, yes. In fact, there are 3 or 4. And when you ask me the question in that way, I'm thinking actually, some of them are pictures of her, and some of them are not actually. But the book, as you rightly say, Lee, there is a mystery even about the book itself. And this is the book. I'm holding it up because I'm thinking to myself, it's quite likely that any other people looking at this book right now will have something like that in their own family treasury. It's a classic 1920s, snapshots and so on. And the pictures inside are absolutely, they're tiny. And this one, which is, well, I mean, you can see the size of that. It's not much bigger than a matchbox. This photograph, I just choose to show it just now because it shows my mother at the age of 3. You heard me say that she was kidnapped at 3. And the book I've just shown you, there are no photographs of her before the age of 3. So why not? Where are the photographs? Where are the baby pictures? Where is a picture of her in a long white gown being christened? There is nothing. And the book, which is, it's a humble little book, but the vast part of it is empty. And it stops, as does the memoir that she wrote for my birthday, roughly at the age of 14. There are no more photographs after that. And so when I was a child and growing up, I used to love these pictures. They were amazing, these tiny little pictures, Kodak, box brownie, very much the sort of 1920s. It's what they could afford. My grandfather, George, was a traveling soap salesman. And this particular photograph, I love especially because my mother looks happy. Of course, it's therefore very precious to me. But it's the only one, I'd say, in the entire album, the only one. And she's smiling in many of them, where I think the smile is real. In so many of them, she's being asked to pose. Very particularly, there's a photograph of her. She's sitting in a tree. She's probably about 8, and he's photographing her, and she's holding up a book called Happy Days, which is an annual that was published for children in the 1920s and 30s, I think even into the 40s. And she actually has got a memory of that day of being sort of blinded by the sunlight coming into her eyes, holding the book up incessantly while he gets his picture. And he was a considerable photographer, and she was tremendously unhappy. And that photograph was always one that she would never look at. But this one, to go to Lee's question, this little photograph here, which, we've looked at 100 times, it just shows a child on a fairy cycle in front of a garage. It doesn't seem very remarkable. But it was taken by the newspaper I work for, The Observer, the picture desk, last year. They wanted to blow up the photograph for the cover of the New Review, which is the section I write for. And they blew it up to something the size, the front of the entire newspaper section. And the more they blew it up and the more they looked into it, the more the picture editor marveled at it. And he wrote to me saying, this is a really tremendous photograph. And actually, if you could only see it with a jeweler's loupe, really close, you can see 100 details. It's fantastic. Was he a photographer? And the question of whether he was a photographer was a great issue for me in the book, because you understand my mother sees him as a total villain. He was bronchitic, he was dictatorial, he had a terrible temper, he shouted a lot. People do, but these things very much troubled her and were part of the reason why she never wanted to see him again, I think. And my picture of him growing up was that he was just this awful, awful man who told her a lot of lies, and that she never wanted to see him again. And when at the end of her years of education, he took her out of, she was about to get I think really tremendous degree, was in front of her, but he took her out of school at the age of 16 and kind of more or less indentured her like a slave to the local post office in this village, where she spent a terrible time in the years of the war. And as soon as she could get away from him and the post office, she did, very much through the kind auspices of a teacher, don't they always save us, heroic teachers who spotted her talent and got her into night school to study art. And eventually she gets away and she gets a place at Nottingham College of Art, and then she goes to Edinburgh, which is where she meets my father, and the rest is history. And she never goes back. I mean, really, how many people never go back? Never go back. And don't go for their father or his funeral, which was extremely strange, obviously for those days, because I found a cutting in the Skegness Times which actually reports the fact that she didn't go to her father's funeral. So it shows you how very parochial that world was, and also what newspapers were like in those days. But to try to find out more about these characters and what they were really like, to find out what was this man so terrible. I looked at his photographs over and over and over again, and I wish I could hold this one up, but there's which I don't have it at the moment, I'm afraid, but the central photograph in the whole book that I think, Lee, you're probably alluding to, is a really beautiful picture of my grandmother, Vida, taken by George. And it's such a great piece of photography. It looks like a Vermeer. She's standing at a window, peeling an apple. Think of maybe Vermeer's Milkmaid, a painting, and indeed an artist that my grandfather had no knowledge of whatsoever. He was just a salesman in Hull at that point. And there were no paintings by Vermeer in this country. There were no reproductions of paintings by him available. That's it. Brilliant. Lee's got it. Even if you can only see that very, and it's not very well reproduced in the book, but it's a sufficiently wonderful photograph that I took it to the V&A, because I didn't really understand how he could have taken it, because he had no money. I mean, how did he have, what kind of camera was it that he could have used to take this picture? And I took it to the V&A, where they said, oh my God, it's absolutely tremendous. They probably used this kind of camera, and, did they have a tripod and so on? And I said, no, they is a salesman from a village. And they said, well, he really had a gift. And I don't really believe that we can pursue the idea of heredity in, composers and artists and so on, the way that people like to think. I mean, it's always said, well, she was an artist. So, I mean, I've always been asked my whole life, can I paint? Because my parents were painters. And no, I can't at all. And I don't think that gene is necessarily a thing that is passed on. It's wonderful if it is, but I don't necessarily see it that way. However, I suppose I had to think about it again somewhat, because I do believe that this man, who was very poor, he was orphaned at the age of 13, a ringing number all the way through the stories in this book. Everybody has a tragedy at 13. And, and I didn't know so many things about him. I didn't know that he fought in the Boer War. I didn't know that he was a medal veteran. I didn't know that he had tremendous powers of draftsmanship that he won awards for. I didn't know anything at all about him. And Lee mentioned a book I had written before, but which is essentially a way of writing about Velasquez, but it centers upon an uneducated bookseller in Reading who finds a Velasquez, or is it a Velasquez, obviously, and nobody believes him because he's just some, hick bookseller. And his story moved me in just the same way, because we know really so little about the ambitions or hopes or abilities of people who leave school at 12. Of course, if they turn out to be William Blake, it's a different matter. But in both these cases, my grandfather and the bookseller, they were really, really looked down on by other people. I mentioned the house at the Cluedo house at the beginning of the conversation, and the Cluedo house was the house of my mother's aunt and uncle, and they just fought in similar things that happened to her uncle, but he'd ended up in India, and then he made good in the Raj, and he made a ton of money, and he was regarded as the local gentry. They were equal. They were both captains. One of them called himself captain for the rest of time, and was very. I think I'm now getting to Dad's army territory a bit. You'd have to sort of think of those figures in the Home Guard who were rather pompous about their experiences in the First War. But so I wanted to find out, really, was he so terrible, this man? Why did she hate him? Why was he never mentioned? And photographs allow us, I think, to do this to some extent, because all the photographs in this book are marvellous, and they were all taken by him. And in some of them, in almost all of them, she is there. He is never there. He's holding the camera. He's in charge of the camera. The combinations of figures are very mysterious, and I think they're mysterious in everybody's family history. You look at a photograph album now, and because nobody wrote down who these people are on the back, so we don't know who they are. And we look at the Christmas photograph and we think, well, if Uncle Jack's there, why is Auntie Janet not there? And who's that guy in the back? Nobody knows. Why is he staying over? What's his role? Who's taking the photograph? What's the relationship between the person taking the photograph and the subject of the photograph? Why are there, I put this to all of you now, why are there, you're in the same position I am, no photographs of Vida with her daughter on the beach ever again? Why is that? Did she never go to the beach again? Did he never photograph them because it was a horrible, horrible memory? Did she not want to be photographed? And so on. And Lee, you mentioned the fact that the book is full of, I suppose it's a sort of way of looking through a door for me to understand things. I think visually, I don't really think verbally first. And I felt that there were paintings that I had looked at in my life that helped me to understand some of the early history of my mother in this very strange story, where it's not obvious quite why she's locked up or who took her. And one of the paintings in the book that I've written about is a painting that some of you may know. I'll see if I can find it. It's a painting in the Musée d'Orsay by Degas. It's called The Bellelli Family, and it's a fantastic painting, nearly life size. When this terrible virus is over, and brilliant, Lee's got it. There we go. So thank you. A huge painting. It's almost as big as Las Meninas. It's almost life size, and I've always found it a tremendously strange and unique painting because it divides its audience. The painting itself is very divided. It's got, the husband is on one side, the wife and daughters are on the other. The room is divided architecturally. There's a lot of light on one side and dark on the other. The husband is sitting more or less entirely with his back to the viewer. If you can see that now, he's in a sort of den on the side. And there's the mother, and she's very upright. And for some people, that scene is showing a real kind of, tarmagant wife who's in charge of everything, and everybody on her side of the scene is, wearing spotless pinafores, and it's all very polished and marvelous, and he's, miserable husband. And for other people, he's just this complete bastard who, is probably having an affair and can't be bothered to be in the picture and doesn't care and isn't making eye contact. And there's a little dog in the picture, and it's just trying to get out of the scene and out of the situation. And I've always thought that Degas was probably identifying somewhat with the dog. This is Degas' own aunt he's painting, and some people call it, he didn't give it a title, but he referred to it as the family portrait. And in my own photograph album that I showed you, there's a picture in which George suddenly appears, more or less out of the blue, with Vida, and the person taking the photograph, I know because it's written down, is my mother. And it's just before she leaves for good. So I guess she's probably about 19, and she's photographing them, and he is turning away out of the picture. He's making no contact with her. He doesn't want to look her in the eye. He doesn't put his arm around his wife. He doesn't smile. He doesn't want to be there. He doesn't want to be in the scene. And so for me, the Degas painting is the way I understand the photograph. Of course, I can't know for certain whether he's looking out of the shot for the reasons I am giving in the book, but I do believe it. And I think that we are all able to look very closely at these family albums and deduce to some extent visual proof, visual evidence. And the book is written, it's as much the solution of the mystery is as much solved through images as it is through documents.
Can I jump in? Can I? Your mother did leave home. She never looked back where George was concerned. But you mentioned that photo, and if I wasn't talking, I would look for it in the book. In that photo, her mother is looking at her, and the look on her face is, I think, very loving. Although she's also clearly a very reticent woman. Later in life, for the first couple of years of your life, Vida came to live with you and your family.
She did. She came and she lived in Edinburgh with us.
So I have loads of questions about her. One of them, I mean, she lived such a constricted life, such a very small, narrow life, partly because of their economic situation and the time, and partly perhaps for emotional and other reasons. But I would like you to talk about your mother's relationship with Vida, if you can.
Well, if my mother was here now, she would weep immediately on hearing Vida's name, because I think she always felt she hadn't done enough for her. She couldn't do enough for her. But Vida was, I knew Vida, and she lived in our house until I was 5. And she was sort of saintly and angelic and silent. She was profoundly deaf. She was very, very gentle. And I mean, without giving too much away, I think we can say yes. I mean, this photograph is so extraordinary to me because she's really quite young, but everybody is so elderly in that era. The pictures would be taken. I think that one must be about she's 20 in the 40s, and she's wearing a hairnet and looking older. I don't know whether anybody, excuse my diversion here, but I don't know if any of you watched The Great British Sewing Bee, which I very much love, because I suppose it sort of takes me back to the days when people made things by hand, and which all of the people in this family do. But the winner this year, who had a sort of strange land girl look. I mean, she actually wore a hairnet in the finals, and she looks infinitely older than she should at the age of 37. And so that photograph pushes her back into the past, my grandmother, because it makes her look so old. But she went around with a stick, and she was multiple jerseys and so on, because she was always cold. But you see, even then, this photograph album has in it the most amazing picture of her. And it's a photograph taken by a news journalist during the celebrations for, I'm going to get the dates wrong, VE Day? No, I don't mean VE Day. George I's coronation, George V's. Come on, somebody help
My
me out.
God, sorry.
1931, I think we are. So I'm so sorry. I'm sure someone will remind me of, brilliantly of what this particular ceremony was. But the whole village has turned into a sort of festivity for, this particular occasion, and everybody got dressed up. And fancy dress was so big in those days, And my grandmother, this little quiet, reticent, mild, and I think intensely long-suffering woman, dressed herself up as a tramp. A woman who would never have had her hair out of place, whose baking was, it was, WI perfection, and she was on the church committee, and she was a very honoured, respected citizen. Her involvement in the war effort was huge. Figures appearing on the beach, shipwrecked and so on, and she took the armed forces into the house and looked after them and so on. So she was a very respected woman, and she dressed up as a tramp, and she spent all day on this particular day pretending to be a tramp, and she bribed the local policeman, the same policeman from the beginning of the story, to keep trying to move her on and shout at her in the street and so on. And she even went to the local pub and tried to get a sort of mug of beer off them and so on. And she won, of course, the prize, because right at the end of the day, she takes this hat off and this coat off, and there is Vida Elston. So again, what stories are we telling where we believe we really know a person's whole being? This photograph's in the album because my mother glued it in there. I don't know whether my grandfather would have done, but it shows her. And when I look up the story in the newspaper, when I look it up, I find that, she was regarded as having come up with the most brilliant deception of an entire village, which is actually what the whole story is about. So,
well, let's go there, because one of the big issues and themes of this book is a kind of, I never pronounced this word correctly, omertia. There was a conspiracy, not a conspiracy, but just a default silence when you went back to do research, when your brother went back, when your brother and your mother went back, and they talked to people face to face and said, what? They all went, no. I know, but I'm not saying. Everyone knew, and this must have been devastating for everyone, knew your mother's story.
It was terrible. And I mean, it made me so angry. I can't. My mother would sit there in rooms with people who'd lived in that village and knew how come there are no photographs of her before the age of 3, say, or who took her and where she was taken and what happened and so on. And none of them would ever say. And nobody would tell her the answer to, I suppose, the most prevailing question in my mother's life and in the book, and the reason why I think she stopped at the age of around about 14 writing a memoir, which was an incident on a bus which involves these villagers. She gets she got a scholarship to go to Skegness Grammar School, which is 7 miles away. So the radius of her life expands, and the only way to get there in the winter time is on a bus. So if you can picture this little green single-decker trundling 1930s bus of the sort that you absolutely do see in Agatha Christie, and it runs from village to village along the shoreline and eventually reaches past Butlins, which is just opened, 1936, and it finally reaches Skegness, the shorefront. And there's only one bus there in the morning and only one bus back in the afternoon, and obviously pain of death if you missed it, because there's no other way home. I mean, she could have walked 7 miles, I'm sure she could have, but the point was that she was terrified of not arriving home on time because her parents were so obsessive about the timekeeping and where was she and what was she doing and so on. And one day, aged 13, she's on this bus, and all these little kids from this one, big kids from the grammar school or on the secondary school are on the bus going home with her. And I see them, and I've written about them in the book, very much as a sort of tragic chorus, because they're always appearing through this story. These are her own peers. So they're aged, 13 to 18. And there are villagers coming back from Skegness with shopping and so on. And one of these people, who she had seen many times, as they're travelling along in the bus through this very flat Lincolnshire landscape in winter with the high white sky, and it's all very getting dark, probably about 4:15 in the afternoon, and this woman who was sitting at the front of the bus, who she had seen often, gets up and walks down the aisle of the bus towards her and holds up a photograph which I take to be about that size and about this fast, and says, "Your grandmother wants to see you." And my mother is horrified because she has no grandmother. But the picture that I showed you that fast, she instantly recognized as being a photograph of herself before the age of 3. So in this moment, she's completely baffled. How could anyone have a photograph of me when I was that small, who isn't my mother or father? And how can she have no siblings, and so on? And who is this woman? And who's this grandmother? And she's like, she goes home and she goes to Vida and tells her what's happened. And Vida says, go and take a bicycle ride. And so they send her off on a bicycle ride. And when she came back some hours later, her father and mother take her. All of this is so something I know all of you can easily picture this. The front parlour in the 2 up, 2 down, never used, cold, with willow pattern on a shelf around the cornice and so on, and a horsehair sofa, and they put her in a seat and they sit opposite, and they tell her that when she was a small child, they took her in as a sort of act of charity, and that this is how it comes to be that there might be a grandmother somewhere. And she wrote about it. She writes about this beautifully in the memoir, and which is in the book, that they seemed not to want to own her or to hold her in any kind of affection. And at this point, her whole life completely split, and she then felt no affection for them anymore, and no explanation was given whatsoever of who the woman was, who the grandmother was, how any of this had happened, how this photograph came into this woman's hand, or who she was. And so this is what they told her, and it wasn't the truth.
But given that, when did she then reconcile with Vida? How much later was that, and what precipitated that reconciliation?
Well, I think what precipitated the reconciliation with Vida was that George died, and Vida was alone. And I suppose if my mother was here now, she would say she grew up. I suppose she grew older. She had children of her own. Maybe she began to think that there was more to it. Perhaps it wasn't quite as straightforward. And she didn't have, as astonishingly, this is the kind of thing social historians are so brilliant at explaining, and I really almost can't believe it, but my mother had no birth certificate. She had no birth certificate, and she didn't even have one when she got married. I mean, I don't know how. I do know how that's possible, but at that, and it was possible in those days. And I don't know. I used to think this was to do with women being chattels or something. It was, but in fact, it actually was quite. It wasn't entirely uncommon, that situation. So she didn't know who she was. And when we were born, my brother and I were born, she did eventually apply for the birth certificate. And it was a tremendous shock to her because she had another name. She, in fact, has had 3 names in her life. And she discovered something about her past. And I think she felt very, very sad, and tried to talk about it with Vida. And Vida was quite elderly by then. And I guess my mother felt, and I think this is very much the moral of her story, that she had made herself. She had invented herself. She had got free. She had soared away. And she did not believe in living in the past. And actually, one of the things, when I've tried to read her little bits of the book, but she doesn't. It's past. It's the past for her, and it matters much more to me that I find out all the details of what happened, and for me, the book is a reckoning with a lot of people, actually. But for her, she always would say, live in the present, not the past. So I don't know.
She also said something really poignant. She told you and your brother that she never felt she belonged to anyone until she had children.
Yes.
So I thought both poignant and beautiful.
Yes. Yes. And the kind of corollary obverse of it, in a way, for me, was that she also used to say, you're my most treasured possessions. And I didn't understand that. And I used to really kind of bridle against it, because I felt I didn't want to be owned.
Yeah.
And as a teenager, and I didn't understand what that really meant at all until I started to research this book and write it. I mean, I love my mother so much. The whole book is really a love letter to her, but I never really liked this locution, maybe, and it's not an important locution now to me at all now, and I do understand it. But there are some legal documents, as you know, in the book, Lee, and the question of ownership is absolutely paramount, and I was horrified. She has never seen those documents, and I was horrified to discover that ownership and possession and to whom we might belong are actually written into these really draconian documents.
Early on, you say that your mother taught you how to remember paintings. First draw the frame, then summarize the main shapes and volumes in rapid thumbnail, and fill in from there. Is that how you approach your writing as well? Is that kind of scaffolding? A lot of people are always interested in writers' techniques. So I'm going to ask you, does that have any bearing on how you actually compose?
What an amazing question. Nobody's ever asked me anything like that. And actually, yes, absolutely. In fact, if I could find it, I would probably show. I'll see if I can find it in a minute. But yes, I think it is, actually, because when I'm writing, I really love structure. I really love the way books are composed. I love the patterns of them and the shapes of them and the way that chapters can be shifted around. And I think of them very much in that way. And when I was writing this book, I mean, not that this is important to anybody, but it is to me. This book is a palindrome. So it starts on that beach that you heard with the picture. It also starts with a photograph, and it ends with the same photograph, which, for reasons that if you read the book you will discover, but everything in it builds up and is then unpicked. So where she was here, we return to the beach at the end. And I used to have I still have them coloured, those coloured post-it notes that you can get there, not just bright yellow ones, but bright pink and green and blue and purple and so on. And I had and I still use this as for when I'm working. I have them all little drawings, exactly as you said, Lee, actually. Yeah. This person's life, that person's life, or this part of the story, or this theme of green shoes are a very big there are great significance in this book, a pair of green shoes. So there's a little drawing of a pair of green shoes, and I put it here, and then I put it here, and so I think of everything visually. And the book before this is written as a plait, so it had 3 colours that had to be moved together. And yes, I do drawings. Actually, found me out. I do.
No finding out. You put it in the first chapter, for goodness sakes.
It's I don't know. It's a funny thing when you're going around. I mean, I haven't been. None of us have been able to go, have we, to a museum to look at art. The last time I went was in March, and I'm about to go again, I think, because the National Gallery's reopening.
Reopening, yeah.
And I can hardly wait. And I was looking at my notes from that last visit, and they're all little thumbnail sketches and so on. And I know where those, and the director of the National Gallery has said that they've mixed the paintings up, and like a supermarket where the goods have been shifted. And I'm terribly kind of, oh my God, you've only got like 35 minutes to do this wretched tour that they're setting up, and my painting might not be, my little one that looks like that won't be there, it'll be there, and so on. So yes, I do think like that. I think I've heard of writers who are brilliantly able to do this just using words. You know, they might put green shoes, or they might put, you know, kind of the red bell or something up, you know, and they could do it with that. But I know it's all done with drawings for me. And the village, I mean, I would love to have included a little map of this village because, you know, Lily Bollis is here and the baker's van, which is very important, stopping here. And there's the sea there and there's the bank there and there's the Cluedo Plan house up here and so on. And I would have loved to have done a little drawing of it. And by chance and delight, the bookshops in Lincolnshire have asked for one to hand out. So in case anyone's going to Mablethorpe or Skegness or, you know, any of those places.
One of our visitors is saying, it's one thing wanting to understand your mother's history, but it's another thing deciding to write and then publish a book about it. So how did that decision, what was that process?
Is the question about how did I dare, or is the question about how did I
there's no shade in there.
No, because actually I have been asked that. I have been, and it's a perfectly legitimate question.
No, it simply says wanting to know the history of your mother/parents is one, but why and how did you decide to write a book about it? It's a very straightforward query.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question. And the answer to that is really straightforward. I couldn't abide the fact that none of us knew what happened on the beach. And I had told this story to my children, and they were fascinated. And, you know, and I just suppose I wanted to really find out that, one. Two, I really wanted to find out whether all the people in the story were quite as villainous or angelic, because nothing in my life says to me that people are as simple as this. So I wanted to find the answers to those things. And also, I have to say, I mean, really honestly, my motives were all absolutely sort of zealous. I wanted to say, my mother is the most wonderful person on earth and I wish you all knew her. I wanted her pictures to appear in print. I wanted her writing to appear in print. And I was desperately trying to think of a way of achieving that. The book's published by Chatham and Windus, which is part of, you know, a big corporate, you know, building. It's just across the river from where I'm sitting now. And, you know, they're really, really kind of keen on sales and so on. And I went to talk about the book to them. And at the time, I didn't think they would publish it at all because it's a tiny compass, a fraction of coastline, very small number of people involved. There are only about 12 people really in this book. And it's all about my mother and me and why, you know, and our family and so on. But I hoped that they would be interested in it and potentially want to publish it, because it seemed to me, just as Uncle Jack is not in the picture, but Auntie Janet is. Why? Every single person has a mother. Every single person has feelings about their mother. Everybody's sort of trapped or freed by the past in some way. Everybody has a photograph album with at least one baffling photograph in it, and everybody knows somebody who's you know, whose big sister turned out to be their mother, or whose father turned out to be their uncle, or whose godfather turned out to have a weird relationship somewhere in there. It's a completely common thing that our ancestors are not quite what we thought they were, especially in this era, I think, just around the time of the Adoption Act coming into being. But finally, in answer completely to that question, I actually did have a desire to, just for simple justice, I wanted the people who had done terrible things to be known to have done them. And the saints and the heroic figures, who are not at all the people you think they're going to be in this book at the beginning, to be recognised. Very, very poor workers in the fields and so on. I wanted the working classes to be seen to have had such small opportunity that even their photographs could contain their artistry trying to get out. And finally, I think I was enough aggrieved by this silence that Lee is speaking of, the omerta. I so agree, that's exactly the right word for it. It is like a mafia conspiracy. And I wanted to say to the people there, if you had not irrationally and obsessively kept every single secret amongst you, all of the people in this story, all of their lives would have been changed. Mine would have been changed. My daughter's would have been changed. Everything would have been different. So there was a little bit of a sort of punitive kind of, I'm against collective silence, if you like. And you can apply that to absolutely any kind of, from politics to, history to our own families. But so, yes, I hope that answers.
We only have very few minutes left. And I don't know if anybody has tuned in from the United States for this event, but since it's digital, on the off chance they might, in the Americas, this book is called 5 Days Gone. Right? Did you have any say in that?
No. I did try in a very delicate way to say, 5 days gone does mean pregnant over here. It's not. And equally, I should say, just a small thing about publishing that makes me really laugh is you saw the beach at the beginning, and it's completely flat, and it's important that it's flat because there's nowhere to hide a child. If you're stealing a child off a beach, there's no kind of cove or rock or someplace you can just secrete them or get them away. So that was really important to the story and the solution of the mystery. And the cover of the American is, I don't think I've got it here, I could show you, but it's absolutely covered in rocks. It looks like Five Go Mad in Dorset or something, and the image on their cover is actually a picture of Cape Cod. And the line there was that 5 days gone girl, anything with gone in the title is going to be commercial, and that everybody recognizing Cape Cod might be more interested. So
well, what a shock to your American readers when they
first paragraph tells you the beach is flat, but anyway.
And in Great Britain,
yes. Yeah.
And finally, just really, really quickly, clearly this is an emotional topic. I mean, mildly fueled by revenge, let's even say.
I'm afraid so.
And yet, so on the one hand, you have this roller coaster of emotions, and as facts emerge and stories are rejigging your head, it must have been at times traumatic, but at the same time, you're a writer and you have to have a certain objectivity when you come to the page. Think about structure, think about narrative flow, etc. How did you do the balancing act?
Gosh, that's a very interesting question. The balancing act was, this is going to sound terribly sort of harsh in a way, but you said about the vengeance. I mean, if your motivation for writing a book is a great love for someone very close to you, or your motivation for the book is to right wrongs, then a great sort of degree of calm comes over you because you've got to get it right. I will only write one book about my mother and my family. I was very, very lucky to be allowed to do it. And I've only got one shot at making you love her the way I do. So every word of it has to be absolutely the best I could write. And so there was never a moment where I found myself kind of, weeping over the text. All I could do was make sure that, I got her across and this story across to the best of my ability. So, it was a privilege to be allowed to do it, actually.
I'm going to remind everyone, this is the book. It's out in paperback if you don't want to get the hardcover. It is time now for me to say thank you so much for being with us tonight on Wigtown Wednesday, and to thank everyone in the audience for coming. It's always great to know that there are people out there who are curious about books. So thank you all so very much. Bye.
And may I thank you too, because it was an absolute delight to talk to you, Lee, and wonderful questions. So thank you very much. And I wish, if any of you are in Scotland, kiss the ground for me.